one of 3 webinars on the roadmap to the revised rental assistance demonstration notice. My name is Tom Davis. I'm the new director of the Office of Recapitalization. This is the office that is responsible for the implementation of RAD. On Monday, as you all know, we published the RAD Notice to implement the expansion of the program as authorized by the fiscal 15 spending bill and to incorporate a bunch of additional lessons learned from our experience to date with the RAD program. We're holding this series of 3 webinars to educate our partners and stakeholders on highlights of the notice. Of course, you all are will need to read the notice itself, but this is a preliminary primer. In addition, we will be holding some Q&A sessions in the next few weeks and developing additional tools and guidance that we hope you'll find helpful. And of course, always open for feedback, and the notice reflects the continuing evolution of the RAD notice and a variety of compromises and efforts to reconcile a variety of conflicting or reconcile different programs' concerns about the program. So this particular webinar is covering the mod rehab portions of the RAD notice. It's section 2 of the notice. We're very pleased that with this notice we can now incorporate the single room occupancy mod rehab properties that were originally excluded from RAD. And so we hope that RAD will become a critical tool for preserving this housing for the homeless. In addition, we've consolidated all of the mod rehab conversions for both PBV and PBRA under the second component of RAD, so that all of the mod rehab work can focus on one section of the notice, which we hope will make it easier for owners and participants to evaluate their options. And it's also within the non-competitive portion of the RAD notice. So with that, I want to hand over this presentation to our 2 experts who are going to be walking you through some of the highlights of the notice. Katie Buckner with the Recap Office and Brian Fitzmaurice with the Office of Community Planning and Development. The team has done a great job in rethinking the RAD conversion process and integrating the SRO properties into RAD. And with that, Katie and Brian.
All right, good morning, everyone. For those of you who are joining us again, you get to hear me talk about RAD notice for another 30 to 45 minutes, so it's very, very lucky for you. So this is the mod rehab section, and this covers both mod rehab and mod rehab SROs. For a point of clarification and clarity, every time I refer to a mod rehab from here throughout the presentation, I am referring to both mod rehab projects and mod rehab SROs unless otherwise specified. All right, so the why revised notice, Tom sort of touched on some of these things, but we wanted to incorporate key expansion changes authorized by the fiscal year 15 appropriations bill, including an increase of the cap on public housing conversions, which doesn't really affect second component conversions, but it's important to note that it's increasing from 60,000 units to 185,000 units, and which represents approximately 15% of the public housing stock. It also expands conversion eligibility for mod rehab McKinney-Vento SROs, and that's about 400 properties with 14,000 units. We're also incorporating lessons that we've learned from the past 2 years as we've been processing these transactions, and hopefully addressing policy gaps and improving the processing and management of transactions, as well as clarifying common questions that we've come across as we've been doing this work. So here's a visual representation of the changes to the RAD notice. So it has animations, and the first one is that it lifted the cap from 60,000 units to 185,000 units. It extended the application period to September 30th, 2018. It includes the McKinney-Vento SROs. It removes the expiration for second component conversion, so there is no longer a sunset date. It allows second component conversions to enter into a 20-year PBRA contract where they were previously limited to a 15-year PBV contract. And finally, it moves the mod rehab portfolio solely under the second component of RAD, and they will no longer be able to come in under the first component. All right. So here's an important note about implementation. So generally, unless otherwise noted, the revisions to this notice are effective for all transactions that have not yet closed. There's a couple of mod rehab projects that applied previously under the first component of RAD, and they will be allowed to switch to the second component upon publication of the notice and be processed under the second component. So eligibility, mod rehab SROs will now be allowed to convert under RAD. A project must qualify as existing housing in order to convert, which means that a PHA must determine that the project substantially complies with HQS through an initial inspection, and that's for PBV conversions. And that also projects that are currently in their initial contract term that terminate early will be limited to PBRA conversions only. So the mod rehab world is a mystery to a lot of us, and so I thought it would be important to sort of go through the processing of a second component mod rehab conversion. And this text is very small, so hopefully you can see it, but I'll just run through the separate steps. So the first step is an initial submission and the tenant notification. So the initial submission is just sort of an info sheet that you submit to HUD so that we can get you set up on the resource desk, and we sort of know a basic amount of information regarding your property. It will also provide us an opportunity to send out sort of a comfort letter of sorts if you're doing a PBRA conversion, so you will have some idea of what your rents might be. During this initial submission phase, you'll also begin the tenant notification process, which is outlined in the notice. After that first step, a PHA will be selected, and that is for the PBV conversions only. And once those two things have been completed, then you will be submitting your financing plan to the recap office, where we will review and approve it. After it is approved, we will issue a RAD approval, and we will begin the process of funding the contract. And that will once all of that has happened, then we will have a closing for the mod rehab conversion, where we will close on the financing if it is needed, and we'll execute the HAP contract, the long-term HAP contract. So the second component allows for streamlined processing, and we incorporated a couple of changes into the second component mod rehab process. One is that we eliminated the need for a mod rehab application, and instead we're replacing it with this initial submission, which will include basic property information like owner name, the mod rehab contract, where the project is located, the number of units, etc. And we also eliminated the use of a Rad Conversion Commitment or an RCC for mod rehab conversions. Instead, we will just issue an approval letter which will outline the conditions of your conversion, and those conditions will need to be met before we can move into the final closing of the conversion. So there's been some updates to the financing plan requirements for the mod rehab conversions, and one of those is that we're replacing the physical condition assessment with a capital needs assessment following the publication of the CNAE tool from HUD, and there's going to be a 6-month transition period for that. We also clarified conditions under which a CNA is not required, and that includes projects built within the last 5 years and projects that will be financed with low-income housing tax credits. We clarified environmental review requirements, which weren't explicitly outlined previously in the notice, and now they are. We clarified the applicability of Davis Bacon for all rehabilitation or construction activity, and that's for PBV and PBRA conversions. And we reaffirmed the ability to reconfigure units, and we established a process for rent setting for reconfiguration, which is especially important for PBRA conversions. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these new changes. So for the environmental review, HUD will not accept nor approve the applicant's financing plan unless the environmental review has been completed for the applicant's proposed conversion project. So RAD transactions will either be reviewed under Part 50, which is for PBRA conversions or PBV conversions that are using FHA financing, or for Part 58, and that's for all PBV conversions that are not using FHA financing. So there's some scenarios where a Part 50 will be used for a PBV transaction, but that would only be if a Part 50 review would be used in accordance with 24 CFR 5811 when HUD determines that the review should be conducted under Part 50. So for rehabilitation at mod rehab properties, Davis-Bacon will apply for those projects with 9 or more assisted units. It will apply to both PBV and PBRA conversions. There's a notice that was published in the Federal Register entitled Applicability of Davis-Bacon Labor Requirements to Projects Selected as Existing Housing under the Section 8 Project-Based Voucher Program. It was published on March 9, 2015. There's no similar published guidance for PBRA conversions, but this office will be using the same requirements that are outlined in this Federal Register notice for PBRA conversions as well as for PBV conversions. So the notice also outlines how and what you will be required to do to reconfigure units. So owners will be allowed to reconfigure their units as part of a mod rehab conversion. For mod rehab SRO projects, however, owners must get permission from their local continuum of care in order to reconfigure the units at their project. We've heard from external stakeholders that the idea of having an SRO unit converted to a studio apartment or even a one-bedroom is very appealing, but we want to make sure that that is actually what the continuum of care thinks is the best way to address the homeless populations in their communities. Rents for reconfigured units will be determined based on the applicable FMR for that unit size for PBV conversions. So right now, a SRO unit is 75% of a 0-bedroom FMR. If they are reconfiguring to a studio, we would use the 0-bedroom FMR. For PBRA conversions, the project will retain the subsidy attributable to those units, and the contract rents for the dwelling units will increase by a share of the foregone HAP subsidy, which will be subjected to 120% of FMR cap. This is sort of a complicated thing, and we hope to have a tool published on our website that can maybe help you understand what your rents might look like post-conversion. So here's just a slide on the PBV rents and how they are set. So the PBV rents are subject to the lower of rent reasonableness, 110% of FMR, or the applicable payment standard that the local PHA has established for their PBV program, less utility allowance, or the owner requested rent. And there's more information about that in 24 CFR 983 Part G. Redetermine rents for PBV contract units. Rent to the owner is redetermined at the owner's request at the annual anniversary date of the HAP contract, or it can be redetermined at such time when there's a 5% or greater decrease in the published FMRs. So if an owner requests their rent to be redetermined, they are subject to the same rent setting mechanism that I outlined in the previous slide. So for PBRA, the rents are the lower of the current funding or 120% of FMR less the utility allowance. And the redetermined rents will be adjusted by HUD's OCAP at each anniversary of the HAP contract, but there is a cap on OCAP adjustments. For the term of the HAP contract, rents will be adjusted by OCAP but cannot exceed the maximum rent defined as higher of 120% of FMR less its utility allowances or the market rents as determined by an RCF. So we included some resident provisions in the updated notice. One is this right to remain or return. So any resident residing in the property prior to conversion has a right to remain in, or in the event that rehabilitation will result in relocation of residents, return to the converted or covered project. Current households may only be screened at the time of conversion for the mandatory screening requirements established by statute. So for PBRA conversions, we incorporated some clarifications. We clarified that for PBRA conversions, 2530 clearance and the affirmative fair housing marketing plan must be submitted with the financing plan, although 2530 is not required for all, and there are some exceptions that are outlined in that financing plan section. We clarify that future changes clause in MARA applies to RAD transactions as well. So for PBV, we strengthen the reserve for replacement account requirement. In the notice we say that you must establish a reserve for replacement account, and we clarify that only occupied units at the time of conversion will be included on the PBV contract. In the closing section, we remove the use of an RCC for second component mod rehab conversions, and we are going to develop a simplified approval letter that will establish all requirements for closing. And with that, I will turn it over to Brian Fitzmaurice in the Office of Community Planning and Development, who will talk about some of the special provisions for SRO conversions that are included in our updated notice.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you very much. The Office of Community Planning and Development, CPD, appreciates the additional options that the RAD conversions will afford to SRO owners. This will be another tool in preserving SRO units for homeless persons as we go into the future. So as we follow the items on the slide here, PBRA, SRO owners will establish an absolute preference for homeless. The owners will. For project-based vouchers, the PHA establishes that absolute preference in their admin plan. The absolute preference has higher priority than other preference adopted and shall apply for the term of the contract in any renewal contracts. The intent of their preference is to ensure that the group these conversions are designed to benefit, namely homeless individuals and families, are the recipients of converted SRO assistance. Mod Rehab SRO owners must consult with the local continuum of care, the COC, on their conversion, as well as coordinated entry for new tenants, rehab, and reconfiguration of units. Katie mentioned this earlier, and just wanted to kind of outline why this is really important. This point is critical. The local COC is the group organized to plan, evaluate, and implement strategies to address homelessness in the local area. HUD looks to the COC to know the local needs and prioritize accordingly. SRO owners should already be participants in the local COC process. And if they are not, we very much welcome them and encourage them to join the COC process. Coordination with the COC aligns the SRO conversion with the local needs and priorities in addressing homelessness in their area. Some reconfiguration proposals may result in less SRO-sized units in favor of units that could be either an efficiency or one bedroom or possibly even larger. In these cases, the COC must be consulted to confirm that a decrease in unit sizes, a decrease in what we know as SRO units aligns with the needs of their community. So in other words, if the local needs suggest that they are, larger size households, then, the COC would recognize that and sign off on it. And as Katie mentioned, some of the older SROs really have that classic design of what you would know as a college dorm, while some of them already do have what the features of an efficiency are. And most, if not all, the providers really do prefer, if they have the opportunity, to have that efficiency-sized unit. It's just a lot. It helps that person, that family, with a better-sized unit. Outreach to new homeless participants should follow the COC's established coordinated entry process. This is probably a new concept for folks that aren't involved in the COC process, but is something that HUD is very much behind and pushing, and in fact is in statute and regulation now. The coordinated entry assessment process is a regulatory requirement for COCs to utilize, which emphasizes ease of access by homeless persons, that identifies and assesses their needs, and makes prioritization decisions based upon those needs. HUD's primary goals for coordinated entry processes are that assistance be allocated as effectively as possible and that it be easily accessible no matter where or how homeless persons present to the system. By following the COC's coordinated entry process, SRO owners have an existing outreach process to utilize as they fill vacant units with persons coming out of homelessness. So there's no need to think that they're on their own trying to go out and do outreach for homeless persons. Their COC should already have a coordinated entry process set up or in the process of being set up. The notice allows for PHAs to establish separate admission policies for former SRO PBV conversions. After applying mandatory screening criteria, for example, sex offender status, the PHA is encouraged to consider additional criteria that does not have the effect of screening out homeless persons, for example, using past convictions, past evictions, or previous debt, which may be applied perhaps in what we call affordable housing or Section 8, but is not statutorily required for these units. These have the effect when you're trying to serve people coming out of homelessness of screening them out, and we encourage the PHAs to take a policy that does not screen those people out. As stated earlier, the intent of the preferences and associated screening is to ensure the SRO conversions continue to benefit persons coming out of homelessness. Finally, the project will continue to be required to report under the COC's Homeless Management Information System, known as HMIS, and the Annual Housing Inventory Count. This is what we call our HIC. In order to retain a converted SRO project under the portfolio of projects that serve persons coming out of homelessness, the project will continue to report under the COC's HMIS system and the HIC inventory count. An HMIS is a local information technology system used to collect client-level data and data on the provision of housing and services to homeless individuals and families. The housing inventory count provides a snapshot of a COC's inventory of housing. The reports tally the number of beds and units available on the night designated for the count by program type and include beds dedicated to serve persons who are homeless as well as persons in permanent supportive housing. HMIS supports data collection and reporting for other federal targeted homeless assistance programs as well, including agreements that we have with VA and Health and Human Services. Finally, listeners should know that CPD is working on our own SRO renewal notice for projects that will choose to renew their HAPs in place, in other words, that will remain SRO, including policies and procedures for multi-year renewals and renewals with pass-through leases. We are trying to get this out as soon as possible, and this Rad notice is giving us impetus to get it out as soon as we can so we can kind of complement, they can complement each other. Please pay attention to the related messages on the HUD Exchange mailing list. If you're not already a subscriber to the HUD Exchange mailing list, go to hudexchange.info/mailing list. The first item on that page is a subscription link. There are numerous categories in alphabetical order that you can choose from under the mailing list, but for upcoming information on the SRO program, please pick the COC category, which is the Continuum of Care. Thank you very much, and I'll give it back to Katie for our question period.
All right, so now we'll open up for question and answers. If you have any, you can either send them in via text or you can raise your hand and we can unmute your line for any questions you may have.
Janet Green, we've unmuted your line for your question.
Hi, I was curious about something that was mentioned regarding the idea of waiving some of the typical rules for Section 8 program for people that are coming out of homelessness, the debt, the criminal screening. Can you say a little more about that and how it applies, and if that's universal across COC programs, shelter plus care, and how that would play into potentially converting an SRO to project-based? Thank you.
Sure, that's a good question. Currently, under the COC programs, we do not have the same statutory and/or regulatory requirements that other HUD programs have in terms of having to screen people coming into our programs. I mean, we're serving people who are, right now we're focusing on chronically homeless. The chronically homeless have a lot of these problems, and if we use the screening criteria, a lot of them that would never be housed. So we do not have a lot of these current screening criteria. What we're saying is I don't think we're talking about waivers as much as because we are converting to either project-based vouchers or project-based rental assistance, there are that short list of screening requirements that are, in fact, required converting into those programs. It would be the sex offender status.
Right.
Never get this completely right.
And the methamphetamines.
Yes. And might be one more. Maybe it's just those two. But what the point that I was making just a moment ago was that, understanding that those categories must be adhered to, we encourage owners for PRA and PHAs, if it's project-based vouchers, to look closely and try to, in addition to those required conditions, to seriously consider not imposing additional screening criteria that would screen people out. For example, past criminal convictions, if they don't fall under those required ones, debt, past debt, things like that might be more routinely used in, affordable housing, Section 8, but are, not required under the COC program. So
not required under COC programs. Okay, so that's something I could potentially look for more guidance on within. Okay.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. I'll check that out. I think the one we bump into where there's confusion is lifetime sex offender registry, and would think even under those programs it wouldn't be allowed to have flexibility on that.
Right. That you would have to adhere to under these conversions.
Okay. Under the conversions, but not
under the conversions yet. Under the COC program, we do not have that statutory requirement, but what we say is we encourage our project recipients, our grantees, to, I guess what we say, use common sense, is to impose them as you think makes sense for that particular project. But if it's a project just tends to be serving just single men, then it's less of an issue if there might be children in the project. I mean, it's not a statutory requirement, but where it makes sense, even in the COC program, it can be used.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
You're welcome.
All right, Regina Montgomery, we've unmuted your line. Regina,
I'm sorry. No, I was having some difficulties earlier. No questions. Thank you.
Okay. Deborah Ernst, we've unmuted your line.
You've unmuted my line. Thank you very much. My name is Deborah Ernst. I am interested in the RAD 2 component for conversion of a mod rehab property. We have yet to make the decision, obviously, because the guidance is really just coming out now between whether or not we will opt for project vouchers through, with a housing authority, or go the route of project-based rental assistance through HUD. My question to you is, we had previously been told prior to the issuance of this guidance that it would be acceptable to renew for a full 1-year term contract, but that term could be interrupted. And what I'm hearing and what I would like to confirm is, one, that doesn't sound like that's correct, that it sounds like the point at which you would be negotiating, concluding what your rents would be, whether you go one route or the other would be at the expiration of that contract. So that's my first section, my first question. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, so if you're renewing your mod rehab contract on a year-to-year basis currently, and
yes.
if your conversion happens to come in month 8 of that or something like that, then you would just be able to convert at that point in time, and at which point in time your mod rehab contract would be
all right. So
terminated.
we were told the correct information. We also are anticipating that this will be a low-income housing tax credit transaction, and in that instance, are you entertaining post-renovated rent studies?
No, we are not. So for a PBRA conversion, your rents are limited to what you're currently receiving. For a PBV conversion, it's subject to the rent reasonableness or the 110% of fair market rent, owner requested rent, and that lesser of test. Okay, so there are no exceptions to that. Right, but so let's say you convert on year 1 and you haven't completed your rehabilitation yet. It's conceivable if you're doing a PBV conversion that when you come back in year 2 after you've completed your rehab and you are subject to the rent reasonableness test, that you could get a bump in rents as long as those rents are lower than whatever the lower the threshold test. Yep. All right. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Okay, Deidre Kemp, we've unmuted your line for a question.
Thank you. My question is, I have a 80-unit mod rehab, and the property has 59 units that are Section 8, and then the remaining 29 are tax credit. With this new, I guess, revision of the program, we are looking at definitely doing a PBRA on the Section 8 side. Is there an opportunity to somehow fold the current tax credit units into this contract, either under PBRA or even the COC? Sounds really interesting. It's not something we're involved in currently, but we do work a lot with the homeless within Waukesha, so I was wondering if that's a possibility.
So in the context of your RAD conversion, you would be limited to the units that are currently on your mod rehab contract, and there would be no opportunity for those additional 29 units for a RAD conversion. But I am sure that local COC might have some rental subsidy that they could attach to the property or something. You might want to just talk to them, but it wouldn't be a RAD conversion.
Yeah, right, it's certainly worth checking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Vince O'Donnell, we've unmuted your line for a question.
Hi, thank you. In the previous webinar, and I think it's relevant for this one, I think it was stated that the tenant protection vouchers in the eligibility event are only being issued for occupied units, and therefore vacant units cannot be included in the RAD PBV or PBRA contract. My understanding was that under current policy, it's in PIH 2015-03, that the exclusion of vacant units from TPVs was kind of a temporary decision based on availability of TPV funds and was not a permanent policy, but now it looks, and that they were in fact being provided currently for vacant units. So does the notice now make this permanently not available for vacant units as opposed to how we're doing this year with funding?
Katie, I can respond to that if you like. This is Diane Thompson. I'm from the Office of Public and Indian Housing, and I'm just on the line to respond to questions concerning PIH programs. In regard to the funding notice, yes, the language you're referring to is correct, that we will assess whether or not there is funding available during the fiscal year or at the end of the fiscal year to fund vacant units. However, I can tell you the way that the tenant protection account has been utilized this year and the limitations, that more than likely there will not be funding available to fund vacant units. So the standard line and what's the most likely is that only occupied units this fiscal year will be funded for all kinds of tenant protection transactions, including RAD transactions.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. So, but if by some miracle we got, say, $250 million for the tenant protection account, under the notice we still couldn't get vacant units without a waiver.
Well, I mean, the amount that we have for this fiscal year has already been determined. For future fiscal years, you know, if we have funding that we are able to, yes, the statute gives us the ability to fund units that were occupied 24 months prior to whatever the eligibility event is. So if we determine that we do have funding in the future that would allow us to fund unoccupied units as long as they met that statutory restricted time period, then we could do that. But under the current fiscal year notice, the amount of funding that's available, I can't remember the exact amount for tenant protections this year, but that's been determined and there won't be an increase in that amount.
Thank you so much for clarifying.
And Vince, just as a point of clarification, so for PBRA conversions for both mod rehab and rent subrap, this whole unoccupied unit is not an issue. Unoccupied units can be included onto those contracts because we're pulling from different funding sources than we are for a PBV conversion.
Really important. Thank you.
Deborah, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I had a follow-up question, and whether or not this is a term of art on the mod rehab, I'm not exactly certain, but we have what have been termed masquerade units when the mod rehab program took effect at this property, and the units are larger than what are currently carried on the HAP contract. The contract rents on the HAP contract are the size of the unit preceding the mod rehab. Is that an unusual situation, and how will that be handled?
So that's a situation that I actually have never heard of, and I, believe it or not, used to work in the mod rehab branch many moons ago, and Brian Fitzmaurice, he did as well prior to my tenure there. Brian, have you heard of that? Had you heard of that before?
I have not.
No,
I have not.
yeah.
It's a clever term, but honestly, it doesn't surprise me this day and age. But
yeah, I think Brian and I are the only two left at HUD that worked in the mod rehab branch many years ago, and neither of us have heard of that. So if you want to talk about that offline, you are welcome to send me an email. My name is Diane A. Thompson. So it's just diane.a.thompson@hud.gov. And we can have an offline conversation.
I would appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Susan Miner, we've unmuted your line for a question.
Yes, we have 22 units that we're converting over to RAD. Of those 22 units, one is actually taken offline to be a continuum care homeless unit. Now, what actually happened to that unit, the one that we're using for the homeless unit?
I guess from my point of view, this is Brian, I guess it would depend on that particular unit what kind of subsidy it has on it. I mean,
it has no subsidy.
I'm sorry?
It has no subsidy on it.
Well, I think as Katie was mentioning that to be eligible for RAD, it has to have a mod rehab HAP contract, whether it's regular mod rehab, what we call regular, or a mod rehab SRO HAP contract. If it doesn't have one of the contracts, it sounds like it would not be eligible to participate in the RAD conversion. But maybe you would have to see what other funding sources might be available.
My name is Michael. I'm sitting here with her. The 22 units is actually a PBV RAD conversion from public housing. We have an unusual situation where we've got tax credits, where we're building a new 22 units at another site. They will transfer to that site in about 12 to 15 months, but the RAD conversion closing is going to happen the next month. So, but it's not a rehab, it's just converting straight from public housing to the PBV.
All right, so this particular call is for the second component, and it sounds like you have a first component RAD transaction. So I would encourage you to talk with your transaction manager about this unusual situation. And we're also having a call this afternoon. It starts at 2 about the updates to the public housing notice.
Okay.
Sandra Newsom, we've unmuted your line for a question.
Thank you. I wanted to find out, once the notice is issued, what will be the process to request a conversion to project-based vouchers, and how long do you think it will take to start the conversion? Is the request to be submitted to the PHA or HUD?
So first off, the notice has been published, so that's good news. And the second is that so you will submit your initial, there's an initial submission, and it's in, I think it's in, I'm not sure what page it's on, but it's in 2.7, I think, and you'll have to develop that, and you'll have to submit that to rad2@hud.gov, and that'll get the process rolling.
Okay.
And then as far as timing is concerned, I'm not sure. Every project is different.
Okay, thank you.
Pat Costigan, you're on the air.
Hello. Yeah, this is probably a question for Brian. Brian, could you say a bit more about the forthcoming CPD notice for what I thought I heard you say, in place multi-year renewals? What's going to be the difference between what will be offered with that option versus what is now available under a Rad conversion?
Hey, Pat, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks. Well, as I think you're already aware, we currently already have the statutory authority under the SRO program, under MARA, to do multi-year renewals, and we've done a couple in the country. And our SRO renewal notice will officially roll that out. I know I've been saying that for much longer than I've been mentioning it to yourself, but it's going to happen. But, I mean, we do have the statutory authority. It won't be that different, really, from, what, a multi-year renewal that the Rad conversion provides for. So, I mean, it allows it for tax credit equity, typically, because you need that multi-year commitment. That's obviously the reason we're doing it, but, of course, it's for, dispersed annually as appropriations provide for. But the basic premise of the multi-year renewal authority that we have under SRO, my understanding is very, very similar to what's, what would the opportunity under Rad.
So there's real. Is it fair to say, Brian, there may be no real sort of need to wait to see that notice? In other words, are there any other distinguishing features that might an owner want to see or understand before electing to go forward with a Rad SRO conversion?
I think that would be an accurate statement. That if we're just talking about doing a multi-year renewal, it's pretty straightforward under SRO. I don't think it would be very similar to what you'd get under Rad. So, if you're weighing the two, I would go ahead and thoroughly review the options in the current Rad notice and see what makes most sense for a given project.
And presume that it all will be nudged under the COC kind of program as well? Is that sort of standard operating procedure now?
I'm sorry, Pat?
So, and presume that the forthcoming notice will also require the working relationship under the COC?
Well, our SRO notice, yes. I mean, that's just built in because, because the COC is the local planning body, primarily for our McKinney-Vento Act programs, but I mean, we strongly encourage COCs, any unit, regardless of what its funding source is. The COC really should be the planning body that is looking at those in a coordinated effort. So, yeah, certainly under the SRO notice, that we will be very strong on coordination with the COC.
Okay. Helpful. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Deetra Kemp, did you have a follow-up question?
I did. On average, how long are these conversions taking? And with the streamlining of the process, I understand that it's different for each project, but what is the average that you're seeing, and what's the average goal with the streamlining?
12 months. We've only really closed 10 conversions under second or first component of RAD, so we don't have a very good sample size, but it's been about 12 months.
Okay. And with the streamlining, want it to go even faster than that?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
And just to follow up on timing, I think it's important to know that some projects, if you're in really good shape and you don't need an actual form of financing, then you would submit your CNA to show that, to demonstrate the lack of need for a huge amount of capitalization, and we could close you fairly quickly. But it's really a case-by-case sort of situation, and we would need to talk about your transaction further to give you any sense of timing. Obviously, the more complicated a transaction is, the longer it's going to take. The less complicated, the shorter amount of time it will take.
Jay Wright, we've unmuted your line for a question.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the discussion on the vacant unit. Is there a definition of what's a vacant unit as far as like a time frame that it's been vacant? I mean, if we're applying for conversion and we've got a 30-unit building, and just prior to conversion, 2 tenants move out, are those then vacant and can't convert, or how does that work?
That's correct. So at the time of the expiration or termination for a PBV conversion only, if the 2 units are vacant at the time that the contract expires or is terminated in the context of the RAD conversion, then those 2 units cannot be included onto the PBV contract.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Got some written questions. A question from Maria asked, if you had already submitted an application, do you need to resubmit under the simpler system?
No, I don't think so, Maria, and I know what project you're specifically talking about, so let's talk about that offline.
Another question from Maria asking, what is the basis for redetermining rents at anniversary? How is reasonable established?
It's similar to a market study. It's in the 24 CFR 983 subpart G, that section for PBV conversions.
A question from Matt Schwartz asking you to describe the process for obtaining exception rent increases during conversion to PBV and PBRA.
So exception rent under PBV is solely if a housing authority has established that, and so the PHA would be the one doing that. For PBRA, there are no exception rents.
So just to piggyback on what Katie was saying for the PBV conversion, exception rents are determined on a area-wide basis, so it's not on a project-specific basis, and it's determined by the PHA for their voucher program. So if they have an approved exception payment standard for a particular area and the project is located in that area, the housing authority would use that exception payment standard as the one of the prongs in the 3-prong statutory test in establishing the PBV rents.
Okay. Todd LaFers asked, what are some of the advantages in converting?
So one of the most important advantage in converting is that you get a long-term project-based subsidy contract instead of a year-to-year mod rehab contract. And the year-to-year obviously is prohibitive from you getting financing to recapitalize your project in the long term. A long-term project subsidy contract is more stable, and you can take it to lenders in order to obtain permanent financing to recapitalize your property.
A question from Rance Graham Bailey asks, is there a mechanism for achieving rent increases, in particular guidance for complying with the supportive services requirement for an above 50% PBV contract?
So there is no mechanism for achieving rent increases, although if your mod rehab rents are lower than what you would get under the PBV program, then you would get a rent increase by virtue of the fact that you're converting to the PBV program. For the supportive services component, that's governed by the local PHA, and so it's not really spoken to in the Rad Notice because you would work with your local PHA who's administering your PBV contract in order to establish the supportive services plan for that project after conversion.
Great. It looks like we've got a hand raised from Ed Laley. Ed, you're on the line.
Yes. Where did you say we could get copies of these slides?
So we'll email them out to all the registrants, and we'll also post them to the HUD.gov/rad website.
Thank you.
Yep. We've got another written question from Alan Kravitz asking, does a PCNA need to be submitted if no refinancing is planned?
Yes, and Alan, I'm sad that you didn't raise your hand so I could actually talk to you, but hope you're doing well in Chicago, and yeah, you would still need to submit a PCNA unless, I mean, we provide waivers for this, but you would have to be like a really new building. Almost always you're going to need a PCNA for a mod rehab conversion.
And then he has a follow-up question asking, would it be a RAD or MAP PCA, and he thought he heard that he would need to wait for the e-tool, which might take 6 months.
No, so for now you can use the RAD PCNA, and the e-tool is published, then you could use, then you'd be required to use the CNA e-tool. But for now, you can use the RAD PCNA if your conversion is imminent.
A written question from Connie Sanderson asking, what resource could I go to find out the difference between PBV and PBRA?
So I think we'll develop sort of a side-by-side comparison, and we'll publish it on the RAD website. And there's one for the first component, but there's some tweaks that need to be made so it's more applicable for the second component transactions.
Matt Snow asks, you mentioned a strengthened reserve for replacement requirement. Can you expand on that or reference those changes in the Rad Notice if it is defined in depth already?
So by strengthened, I maybe oversold that. So it's more that we're requiring a reserve for replacement account to be established when you convert your mod rehab project to a PBV contract. And so that's not a concept that exists in the PBV program right now. And so, but it'll be established by what is set forth in your PCA or CNA.
A written question from Bonnie asking, she says, our PHA has the monthly minimum rent requirement for our SRO tenants that have no income. If we convert our SRO to the PBRA contract, will HUD also waive the monthly rent requirement of $25?
If you you can submit a waiver request to HUD for that, and HUD will consider that.
A question from Vince O'Donnell asking, will HUD consider allowing a multi-year renewal option for non-SRO mod rehabs as currently allowed under MARA?
I don't know if that's been happening or not. You probably need to talk to your local multifamily field office about that. Or Diane, if she has any input on that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Can you repeat that question?
Sure. He's asking if HUD will consider allowing a multi-year renewal option for non-SRO mod rehabs as currently allowed under MARA.
So a renewal outside of RAD. So PIH, we have not discussed that possibility, but rather we are encouraging mod rehab owners to convert under RAD.
A written question from Al Hester. Could a conversion of a mod rehab SRO project to PBRA be combined with moving the subsidies from an obsolete building to a new building constructed specifically to replace the old one?
Yes, absolutely. We would need to talk with you about your transaction a little more in detail, but that is the option in the second section of the notice, and there's we describe it a little bit in the notice as well.
A question from Myrna Hooper asks, if I understood correctly, PBRA conversions and PBV will have a preference for homeless individuals and families. The families that have a right to return do not qualify under the homeless status. if they were housed at the time of conversion. Please clarify eligibility requirements.
So for mod rehab SROs, they will have a preference for homeless individuals and families. However, the families that could potentially be affected or moved from the building and then allowed to return would not technically be considered homeless anymore. But because they have a right to return to the mod rehab SRO project, they would be able to remain in that particular building.
Right.
Just for those current residents.
Right. The way we would, correct, I totally agree. I mean, in other words, we would still recognize them as retaining their original homeless eligibility. You know, if they had to leave temporarily for like construction or something, bottom line is if they were originally in the unit as a homeless person, now we're talking about individuals in SRO units, yeah, they would not lose that initial eligibility status.
All right. Looks like we've got another question from Pat Costigan. Pat, you're on the air.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Brian, isn't it possible that somebody could be in an SRO unit that was not formerly homeless, just qualified under long ago SRO eligibility requirements, and therefore in the conversion they still would be eligible to stay in place? Is that not the case?
Well, yeah, I mean, that would have been someone who came in, about 25 years ago, because, I mean, if you technically look at the statute and the regulation, I mean, it does more or less suggest that, you know, there's a preference for homeless people, but the way that we have operationalized that really for the, you know, the length of the program is in fact that persons in an SRO unit should have been homeless as defined by HUD when they came into the unit. I guess if there is someone who came in a very long time ago, you know, I think we'd look at that on a case-by-case basis. But, I mean, for all practical purposes, if someone's in an SRO unit, they should have come in, you know, presented to the project originally as a homeless person.
Okay, very good. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a written question from Tim O'Byrne. We are planning a rehab project with tax credits. Our tenant relocation plan provides that upon notice of award and prior to closing, we will allow some units to vacate through normal attrition and vacancies. We plan to leave those units vacant prior to closing and construction starts. Will this keep those units from being included in the PBV conversion?
Yes, but I think we need to talk about your transaction a little bit more. So if you could send an email to rad2@hud.gov, and one of us can give you a call about your transaction.
A question from Darcy Mulholland. The PBV SRO payments are less than the present SRO mod SRO unit payments. Is there a way to pay at the studio rate rather than the SRO rate?
Well, that would be rather unusual that project-based voucher rent would be less than our SRO rent. Essentially, under the SRO program, they are allowed to have a studio-sized unit. The statute provides for that. However, the rent is currently calculated at a SRO level. In other words, 75% of the zero bedrooms. So I guess we'd have to look at that, you know, individually. But typically, I would think, you know, an SRO, McKinney-Vento SRO rent most likely would not be as high as a project-based voucher rent, depending on the situation.
Right, and Darcy, so for this particular scenario, it might be more appealing for you to convert under PBRA because you would get the rent that you're currently getting under the PBRA conversion.
But I actually think that Brian is correct, because under PBV, if it's a zero bedroom, then it's going to be 110% of 75% of the FMR. Our program counselor explained it to us that under the regular SRO program where it's a zero bedroom, the allowance under the PBV statute to go up to 110% of the FMR would apply. So since the SRO restriction is to 75%, there would be an additional bump up for a PBV conversion in the case of a zero bedroom unit.
Right, and just to add on to that real quickly, what MARA provides for the SRO renewal is a little bit different than mod rehab, but we renew at the lesser of the current expiring rent adjusted by the OCAF or the budget-based rent, whichever is less. So that is yet a little bit different than mod rehab, but that, so you know, for planning purposes, that's what a current SRO renews at. And so again, the expiring rent adjusted by the OCAF or the budget-based rent, whichever is less. That's what SRO renews at.
All right, we have no more written questions, so just looking to see if anyone has a hand raised. Last call for questions.
All right, so it looks like we don't have any more questions. I'd like to remind you all that we're going to have a question and answer session Friday at 3 p.m. that you're more than welcome to call into and present any questions that you may have. And you can send follow-up questions to rad2@hud.gov, and we'll try to get to them. And any written or verbal questions that we received that we weren't able to go completely into detail on, we'll attempt to answer those questions and post them on our website. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you for all of your questions and contributions. Have a great day.